Today on the show, Kyle and myself, Andrew, we're going to go over end-of-game procedures and a couple little other pet peeves that we have about the game. And that's going to be what we're going to talk about today. So let's get right to it. Hey, Kyle. What's going on?
What's going on, man?
Today is the day.
The day
That we talk about one of the things that a lot of people don't really talk about, because I think we've gotten to a point where we've kind of accepted that the end of game procedure is what it is, and we just kind of tried to move on from it. I think the colloquial mentality is just play faster.
Yeah,
Play faster.
Don't go into time.
Don't go into time, because when it goes 0, 1, and you're done, it feels bad. Your opponent's at 7, you're at 5, but they had no cards left in deck, and you both lose. Nobody gets any points, and everything just feels bad.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about that. And I know some of you are watching the video and you're thinking to yourself, why are we talking about something that is an integral piece of the game? Like it is the game. Effectively, when you go into the rules of the game, it's the game. That's what it says in the rules. It says, hey, here's end of match procedures. 0, 1, you both lose. And that's it. Unless somebody can kill the other person and take them down to 0. But fundamentally, if you look at other trading card games, Magic the Gathering being one of them, a game can and should evolve when there are glaring issues. For example, if anyone is familiar with the Digimon trading card game, in the Digimon trading card game, one of the biggest detractors from the game is the fact that you can't mulligan in the game.
Yep.
So there are a lot of schools of thought that that game should adopt mulligan, but they won't. And if you're not familiar with the term, basically when you mulligan, you take your hand, you're like, oh, I don't like this hand. You shuffle it back in the deck, you draw a new hand. And the reason that's important, specifically for Digimon, is the fact that you have to have a very specific type of card in order to evolve your Digimon. And if you don't have that card, then you get stuck and your opponent can just run away with the game while you're trying to catch back up. And it's a very slow process to catch back up. So the reason I mention that is that when you have something like that, it only hinders the growth of your community. Because as people come into your community and discover your game, and they get when they get familiar with that little flaw or that little thing that everyone doesn't like, and it's a shared communal gripe, then it's a negative element that slowly poisons the well and doesn't prevent, but it does hinder in such a way the growth of your community. And instead of having explosive growth where everyone's coming in and doing really cool and fun things, you get this kind of staggered growth where people are coming in and they're finding that little thing and they're like, oh, I don't like this. And we've had people that have disappeared from our community because they've also run into this very specific thing that we're going to talk about today. So if you're not super 100% familiar with it, it is, we play a game, we sit down.
Yep.
We have technically 45 minutes with 5 minutes to sideboard, but a total of 50 minutes. So if you can sideboard quickly, then you can get into the game quickly. We draw our 4 cards, we begin the game. And the reason there's no mulligan in this game is because you're drawing so many cards at the end of a turn. And the way that the game plays out, you don't need a specific card to play the game. All the cards can push the game forward because of the fact that every hero has access to a weapon or has access to something that creates the weapon or creates momentum, i.e. they can deal damage to you and they can push the game forward no matter what they draw. And then there are some times where you will look at your hand and you can't really do much in the way of damage, but you can do some things in the way of setup, and that is still pushing the game forward. So this game is one of the rare few examples, I think, that you just don't really require a mulligan, that you don't really need a mulligan. But I digress. So we play the game, we go, and sometimes we use the whole 50 minutes.
Yep.
And it's best of 1. So if we get to the end procedure and we're both there, time gets called, the active player will be turned 0. And they'll finish their turn and they'll try, if they can, to kill you and take you down to 0. And if they can't, then you get to become turn 1. 0, 1. But after turn 1, there is no turn 2. We don't play for a certain amount of time. There's not like a 5-minute limit or a 10-minute limit or any of those kinds of things. What happens afterwards is we both lose. We don't tie. We lose. Because when you tie in any other Swiss system, in any other trading card game, you get a point, I get a point. But in this game in particular, we both lose because we don't get any points whatsoever. And if we lose in an early enough round, based on the overall tiebreaker system that they have, we really lose because now we're almost guaranteed to never get anywhere as far as top 8 is concerned, which is where you want to be, especially when you're playing competitively. And it just doesn't feel good. What are your thoughts on how it feels to be in that same situation, especially as a Prism player?
Well, like my one big pet peeve about it is like when your turn 0, it doesn't matter where you are in your turn. That's 0. So like if you're at the end of your turn where you've already played all your cards, maybe your opponent's thinking about a block, maybe something's going on. Mm-hmm. The second 0 hits, that's it. You're not winning anymore. The game's over because now once it goes to your opponent, it's either your opponent wins or you draw, and the draw's a double loss. And like most games, when they implement the system, they try to go 0, 1, 2, 3, and they'll end on that third turn. So you don't really feel like you're held hostage. But in this game, because of how turn 0 works out, if your opponent just wants to take that extra couple seconds to think about every action to respond to what you're doing, you just lose the game.
Yeah. And so this all comes into this bigger conversation that the community has had. And you're watching this now, and what we want to do as much as we can is communicate about this so that way it becomes a different conversation and it becomes forced into a different trajectory. And what is that trajectory? The trajectory is that we put enough pressure on LSS to change it because we want it changed. And when I say we, I'm talking about the community that is here right now, that is putting in the time, energy, and effort into growing the game. And as much as LSS is doing things like they've got $1 million prizing for Pro Tour, that doesn't do a lot for the casual community. And what we're doing and what you're doing in your local game store, that's what's building up that casual community, and that is what is servicing the overall game overall. So as the consumer, we can band together and we can tell the people that are developing the thing that we consume that we would like it to be a specific way, and we can talk with our money, and we can also talk in the forums, and we can talk on the servers and everything else, and we can basically send them the message that, hey, we really want you to change this element about the gameplay because it's very detrimental to the overall growth of the game. And it really is. And we're going to kind of dive into it and why it is and just all the little particulars of it. And that's basically what the show is going to be about today. Because at the end of the day, there's so many ways that we can address this. And, you know, Kyle and I, we're going to play devil's advocate with each other, but we're going to try to come up with solutions because we never want to criticize without also having something constructive that we can put forward as well. So the first thing I want to talk about very, very specifically is control, mid-range, and aggro. And why those 3 styles of play always determine your end-of-game procedures. Like, it doesn't matter. So, for example, in Dragon Ball Super card game, there are aggressive strategies that use your life as a direct resource. Same thing with Magic the Gathering. There are aggressive strategies that use your life as a resource. So you trade your life for more aggression to push against your opponent, so that way at the end of, you know, the match or whatever the case may be that you're doing in particular within that, the end of the game in that particular series for that match overall, you can try to beat them, take them down to 0 by sacrificing some of your own life. So with that being a strategy, it would be a little unfair to say, okay, well, when we get to the end of game procedure, whoever has the most life wins. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Yeah, it'd feel pretty bad.
Okay, it would feel pretty bad, right? Yeah. Okay. So does that apply to Flesh and Blood? A little bit, right? So we have 2 classes. We have the Shadow Brute, and we also have Shadow Runeblade. And both of those classes have cards that are designed to be aggressive, and they carry what is called Blood Debt. And if Blood Debt sits in your banish zone, you're going to lose life at the end of your turn if you don't have a way to turn it off, okay? But is that the same thing as what I just described in Magic the Gathering and Dragon Ball Super? Because you get to choose whether or not you use the mechanics that will add those things in. It's not a direct relation of the card. For example, I'm not paying a life to play this card. The card is just penalizing me if it's in the banish zone. So would you say that's the same thing?
Not really. I feel like Blood Debt is something that you choose to put in the banish zone. You know, whether you're making the shackle or you're playing the Levia cards that put the cards into the banish zone. And then even with Shadow Brute, you actually have the hero power to turn it off. So I feel like it's more of a penalty for just making mistakes, if anything.
Yeah.
Whereas you're not really actively choosing, hey, I'm going to pay my life to use this attack. We don't really have a hero that does that.
Yeah, and so if we go to the overall idea that at the end of turn sequence, 0, 1, okay, who has more life? That person is the winner. Is that fair? And that's a question. Is that fair? And maybe it could be something different. So, for example, you have pieces of equipment, and you can choose to run different pieces of equipment that doesn't break, equipment that has battle worn, equipment that has arcane barrier, doesn't have arcane barrier, whatever the case may be, that doesn't actually have any defense values. And maybe that could be a litmus. There are several key points in the game that could be a litmus for who's actually winning the game. And even deck count could also be a way to determine it as well. And then it's like, okay, so how do we get to a point where we make something fair that's going to lead itself to being fair for everyone, and it's going to be something that is going to be accepted globally by every member of the community? And that's where we come back to aggro, mid-range, and control. And I think we haven't clearly defined what those three things are for the game, and that's the reason why the end of game procedures are what they are right now, because nothing feels really fair because we haven't accurately defined them. So let's talk a little bit about each of those three things and how they apply. We talked a little bit about aggro, and we've mentioned two decks that are very aggressive. Shadow Runeblade and Shadow Brute are very aggressive decks. And because they're very aggressive and they can do things for cheaper resource costs, they have the penalty or the drawback of losing health if these Blood Debt cards are left in their banish zone. But they're not actively using their health to play the cards. This is just a penalty for for having access to all these low resource cost attacks. So if you want to run these low resource cost attacks and you want to be very aggressive, then you can get penalized if you miss sequence or you don't play correctly and you can't get these cards or you don't turn off the Blood Debt. If you can't get them out of your banish zone. So I think it's fair in the context of aggro to say whoever has the highest life should definitely win the match when time is called. I think that's very fair. In terms of aggro, would you agree or disagree?
For aggro specifically, yeah, I mean, I get that. Life is more or less the thing you're racing down. It's just like in a control strategy where you're not taking the damage. Like, that's where it throws me off, because I can't just, in an aggro sense, yes.
Yes.
But how do we define that to everybody?
Exactly. So now let's talk about mid-range. Now, mid-range, in terms of other trading card games, is always the idea that you're looking for a big combo, you're looking for a big setup. I think in this game, if I had to like really choose a class and a combo strategy that I think ultimately defined what our idea of mid-range was from other trading card games, it would be Bolt and Sabers, because that's what they're trying to do. They're basically trying to block out, attack, charge, and get to a point where they can go double Lumina and finish you off by breaking their Courage of Blade Hold and doing those other things. That feels like the ultimate mid-range strategy. And again, this is as I would define it from other games, not what mid-range is in this particular game. And based on that, if they're blocking out and they pull their combo off, then by the time they pull their combo off, in optimal settings and conditions, they're going to do about 30 damage to you. Mm-hmm. So if from that point they just block you out and try to fatigue you, like switch from an aggro to a control, which is what mid-range is supposed to do, then is it fair in the context of that type of situation where there's really nothing you can do against a 30 damage turn, that at the end of the game, when we call time, they have more health because they gained health, they were able to pop off, do their big mid-range combo attack, and then you're left there with not enough health to say or define that you are the winner, even though maybe there's nothing that they can do anymore, right? They've done their one big attack, they've blown their one big combo, and now it's like if you can just bleed them out a little bit, then eventually you could get back in. So would it be fair for mid-range if that became a thing that, at the end we're going to determine who's the winner based on health? What do you think?
It feels bad because like he can only do it once. He can only pop the courage once and then swing it a bunch of times, and then from there he's literally just trying to inch in a win, or until he runs out of cards and he just can't do anything. So it's like it feels almost like deck size at that point is the better argument over health, because he can literally just wait for that big turn and just gain 6-7 life and deal 30 damage. So it's like life doesn't feel fair in that instance.
Okay, so let's move to control. Now, traditional mindset of what control is, what it does, from other trading card games, and we're transposing that idea here into Flesh and Blood. If I had to pick a class and a way that it plays to be like, man, this is the ultimate control deck, I would really have to say, and normally I would say Oldham, but I'm really going to say Prism is really what I would envision control is. And here's why. A lot of what Prism is trying to do is force you to play a certain way, and that's tempo. And a lot of what Prism is trying to do is shut down what you can do for the turn based on damage prevention, i.e. none of your on-hit effects go off, which is effectively counterspelling or canceling. And it's also trying to stop your bigger turns with cards like Arclight, which is effectively, stopping your ability to attack. So like ending combat phase, things of that nature. So if you look at it from that point of view and you think about a deck like Prism that proved it can definitely fatigue out, stall out, defend out, and it did that during the Chain Assance, if you want to call it that, when Chain was sitting at the top of the meta. Then does it become fair for a deck like that to be able to inch you out, block you out, keep all of its health, and then we get to the end, they call time, and the Prism player's at 36, and the other player's at 22, and now you win because you have more health. Does it feel fair for the quote-unquote control deck?
And that's why it's all just such a hard call. I feel like Prism, when Prism does it, even though she has a high life total, she also keeps a larger deck total. Mm-hmm. She actually doesn't give up that much. Usually in the Fatigue Prism matchup, we'll actually get their deck down to 0 while we still have cards. So usually we'll be winning by life and cards. Mm-hmm. And the other time that wasn't true was with Chain, but Chain just did too much at the time. So usually we'd live with our last 5-10 health.
So yes or no?
Oh gosh.
Yes, it's fair.
For her to win off of health, yeah, it doesn't bother me. Mm-hmm. Health is a good way to determine who the winner is. It's just I think the deck argument also works because when you're doing, the aggro strategies, you're giving up cards. You're actively trying to push in, and if your opponent can defend out and keep their deck, that's also a good way. I'm drawn in the middle, but I think health is a good determiner on, in all these instances.
Yeah. I think based on the idea of what we're looking at here, right, we've looked at 3 different ideas of what these deck archetypes are when it comes to aggro, mid-range, and control. For the control idea of it, the fatiguing is, I think the fatigue strategy for any deck is a control variant. And I think that's what we need to start looking. When we look at these archetypes, we should look at them more as variants and not actual deck archetypes. Because every deck can do this. Every deck. I could build a Rhinar deck, a Levia deck. These are brute classes that are designed for aggro. And I could build them to fatigue. Mm-hmm. So it's really just deck variant. And I think the control variant for this game is fatigue. And what is fatigue? So fatigue is effectively resource management to the point where your opponent decks themselves out and you don't. That's it. That's basically what it is. So if that's what that is, and that becomes a new element to the conversation, i.e. resource management, then it kind of comes back to what we were talking about before. If aggro and control feel good for life, but mid-range doesn't because they can pop off and take a big chunk that you can't prevent, so they could literally stall you out to near the end of the game, do one big pop-off, and then just kind of buffer you out and edge you out for a win, then that feels bad. But it's still a 2-1, right? So it doesn't feel 100% bad, but it does feel bad when you're up against a mid-range opponent. But maybe that's good for mid-range as far as the variant is concerned. Maybe this mid-range variant, which is not a fatigue strategy, it's an aggressive strategy that transitions to a fatigue strategy. Maybe that's good. And then with the whole idea of this resource management, it feels bad when you talk about aggro, right? Because aggro is not very good with resource management in the terms of what it is doing, and that is, i.e., spending cards, using cards. We have to kind of, how shall I put this? We have to kind of think of resources in two different ways. The first way we think about resources is the traditional method, and that is I pitch a card and I create actual resources, right? Mm-hmm. But the second resource model is the number of cards in your deck. And a lot of what we've done with deck construction is we have this idea of 80 cards, but we also have this other idea of here's my 60 card core because it's a minimum 60, and then here's my sideboard, and then here's the pieces of equipment that I switch in and out as well. And that doesn't make sense in the terms of fatigue strategies, because if I'm going up against a deck that can fatigue, then I need a lot of cards in my deck, and I need to be able to edge them out in the long game, because that's what's going to happen. I'm going to try to push through damage, and their idea is to just defend and regain health. Defend, regain health. And so I have to make sure that I can bleed in 1 damage, 2 damage, 3 damage, and keep them on the defense so that they can't actually come back and push against me. But if we're having this conversation, then it becomes a viable strategy. A viable strategy in the sense that fatigue needs to be something that is acknowledged. It's part of the game. It's something that you do. And so since it is something that you do, then it needs to be respected. And if it is respected, then getting down to the end of the game and saying, hey, health it determines, I think that becomes more of a more palatable thing. But I think also we could do it in the sense of where your deck is, right? So like you're always looking for multiple tiers to how you determine who's going to win at the end, right? So optimally, we go 0-1. Hopefully somebody says 0. Nobody says 0? Okay. Who has the most health? Nobody has the most health? Okay. Who has the highest deck total? And then deck total becomes kind of your life. So if you can force your opponent, based on your weapon selection, based on how you utilize your resources and how you deal damage to them, to use more of their cards to prevent you from dealing damage, and you use less of your cards, or you add more cards to your deck construction, then you can edge them out in that tier 3 if you happen to go, health for health with them, and then we can't determine the winner that way. What do you think?
I think it's really interesting. I think there's honestly an argument for both ways. I think like if you really want to break the game down, like mid-range and control sound weird, but if you really did just take it to like aggro, combo, and fatigue, you really like paint a better picture for Flesh and Blood. Mm-hmm. And like I think there's a huge argument that like deck total even comes before health, if you want to argue that over like, because it just feels bad with combo. Fatigue in general, like just having like your deck total could be the first thing you check, and then life could be second. I mean, you could do it any other way, right? Like, you could do like the turns and then do life and then do deck, or you can do turns and then go deck and then life. Either way works. It's more of the bigger conversation of which one feels better. But I think fatigue's a real thing. I think it's an optimal strategy, and it's shown. Like Oldhim's shown up, Prism's shown up, and they've all had these like very, I'm going to wait and stall the game out.
So, okay. What the conversation turns to then, if we're looking at what Kyle said, right? So if we're looking at, we go 0-1, then we go deck total, and then we go life. If we're looking at that, then what we're really saying is if you want this game to be highly skill intensive, and if you want to reward a high skill ceiling on a player base, then doing deck total makes the most sense. Because if you are blocking conservatively, setting up for 5-card hands, and performing your turns efficiently and smartly based on the matchup, then you're going to utilize the fewest amount of resources possible to have the biggest impact. That's why Lightning Briar is doing so well in the meta right now, because Lightning Briar is pushing across an average of 16 damage with very, very few resource commitment. And they're doing it on 5 card setup turns. Not on 4 cards, not on 3 cards. They're doing it on 5 cards. That's where they hit their stride. That's where they hit their average. So a really, really good Lightning Briar player is not throwing out their entire hand unless it's a 5 card setup turn. And then even then, they should still be pulling one draw and setting up for the next 5 card setup if they sequence it correctly. Am I correct in that?
Oh, yeah.
So based on that thought process, does it make a stronger argument for your deck count? Because even as an aggro player, if you're playing very efficiently, then either A, you should kill your fatigue opponent because you're building these 5 card hands that are harder to block really the higher burst of damage, or you're sequencing your attack reactions or your buffs in a way that you're baiting out their big defense reactions, and then you're squeezing in more tail end damage. But the point is, it makes a stronger argument for higher skilled aggro players to get in and be able to go, okay, well, I'm at 32 cards and you're at 31, so I have the most resources, then I should win this tie based on the fatigue matchup. What do you think?
Well, I think like aggro in our game is so much different than like in every other game, because in most games, aggro is play your cards as fast as you can, deal as much damage as fast as you can. But in Flesh and Blood, you always draw back to 4 at the end of the turn. So even though aggro is still aggro, you're using these resources that go away. And that's why I think, yes, the deck total probably ends up being the more favored approach, because it's like, if you're truly an aggro deck that's trying to push an aggro strategy, you need to get there. You need to get them to 0. And if you're not getting them to 0, you're running out of cards.
I think a lot of the gameplay falls apart with the newer players because they don't get into the habit of these 5 card setups, and they don't block conservatively. If you look at your 4 card hand and you're thinking to yourself, I want to have a turn, then sometimes you take damage that you shouldn't take. And then you end up not using all 4 cards, or you end up not effectively getting across what you wanted to, when you could have just blocked with 1 card, prevented 3 damage, swung your weapon with a buff on it, and then your last card is the 5th card that you arsenal for the next turn, which would be a bigger 5 card setup turn. Mm-hmm. Or you don't really have your big combo. Like when I play Rhinar, if I don't have Blood Rush Bellow, a lot of times, if I can't push across at least 8 or more damage, I'll block. But a lot of newer Rhinar players, they're looking at their hand like, oh, I need every card, because Rhinar is very hand intensive, so I'm not going to block and I'm just going to take the damage, and then I'm going to try to push across as much damage as I can, and they end up only pushing across 1 attack, and then they have these extra cards left over, so they're like, oh, I don't want to arsenal that. So now not only have they lost momentum because they didn't push across enough attacks to actually do anything to their opponent, then they also didn't arsenal cards, so they didn't set up a 5 cards, which means they're going to have a weaker turn in the future, and there's just all these little things that come into that. So I'm very intrigued and excited by the idea and the concept of doing deck count, because I feel like deck count would force you into these very unique and skill intense positions. So for example, if let's say you're playing Prism, right, and you get matched up against a Viserai player. So now Viserai can do this huge pop off, this huge OTK, where they can just build up rune chance, and they can be very conservative with their cards because of the fact that they have all this really good 2 costs, this 2 defense armor, and then they can be like, I'll block 3, and then I'll do this, but it'll make a rune chant. They can do a lot of this defense reaction stuff, so they can spend less cards and then wait for a big turn to push across and get you in a position where you have to use more cards than they do. And so in that particular situation, fatigue doesn't feel like the way to go. So now you have to kind of change the dynamic of what you're doing against that very particular matchup, because you know that if you go to the end of the game, they're going to have more cards in their deck than you will, just based on what resources you have to spend in order to push across damage to kill them, or just to get into that situation where you just have more cards than they do. And that might mean that you go on this aura plan, right? Like where you're just like, okay, well, if I need to conserve more cards, I put more auras out, which means I'm pitching more cards, which means more cards are going back into the deck, and then I'm using those auras to attack, so I don't actually have to commit any other resource other than maybe one card to create a shield, and then I can commit less cards because those cards actually aren't going to go into the graveyard. They're going to go into my soul, which is going to help me to create more shields, which is going to be more resource efficient. So I can just go on this aura plan, but it changes the dynamic of how we play, and it actually creates a situation where we know what that end game is going to be, and we don't get penalized for Blood Debt, and we don't get penalized for any other strategy that might come into play where we're sacrificing health in order to do something on our turn. So I think deck count actually might be the way to go, and it actually feels really, really good. And I think it only hurts Levia. I think Levia is the only one. So Levia says, when I attack with X, Y, or Z Shadow Brute card, I have to have a certain number of cards in my graveyard. Well, in order to get cards into your graveyard, you got to block.
Sure.
You got to do things.
Oh, yeah.
So that means I'm spending a lot of cards to do a lot of Shadow Brute things. And I mean all the things. We're talking the non-attack actions that buff things. We're talking attacks. We're talking everything. So I think this whole strategy for deck composition, as far as we get to the end, I think it only hurts Levia. But even then, Levia could build around it.
I also think it changes things because you go from this, I always want to run exactly 60 to see every card I want to see, to maybe I play 70 cards.
Yeah, I mean that's really all there is to it. But look, we'd like to know what you guys think in the comments, so definitely say something to us. Let us know what's going on, and we hope to see you really soon once the competitive season starts up. And be looking forward to an announcement because we are going to be hosting a huge tournament for Everfest, and we look forward to seeing you guys. Take care. Peace.